everyone. This is Greg Tom with Management Roundtable, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar. And right now, I'd like to turn it over to Michel Delafer from Planisware, who's going to get us started. Michel?
Thank you, Greg. Good day. My name is Michel Delafer, and I'm a sales director with Planisware. Planisware is a project portfolio management software focusing on supporting the new product development business processes from end to end. And we've been in business with top leaders in innovation for over 20 years now. In recent years, we've been highlighting thought leaders such as Dr. Cooper at our user conferences, and when our customers ask for more substantial business learning formats, we decided to enhance our software services by offering and sponsoring education dedicated to process improvement in new product development. We've launched the Planisware Center for Excellence to champion, on the one hand, established, proven best practices in project portfolio, and as well as emerging and promising practices in new product development. Our mission has been to bring thought leaders to you via different outlets such as Management Roundtable today. Bob Cooper is one of the speakers who we are highlighting today. Bob Cooper is a world expert in the field of management of new product development and product innovation. He has written several books. He's published over 120 articles on the topic. Bob, it's a delight once again to introduce you to an audience on the web. They want to know about Stagegate and Agile. Please take us through what you have learned over the last while on these topics.
Okay, thank you, Michel, and it's great to be with everybody here. Let me get into this session, which is roughly half an hour, maybe a bit more if there are questions. So I hope you hang in there with me. We're really talking about combining the best of two very interesting models. One is the Stagegate system, which has been a familiar process to manufacturers anyway, people that produce physical products. I'll just label you guys manufacturers. And that would include anybody from food and beverage to machine tools and automotive equipment. Combining the Stagegate process with the Agile process, which of course is the method that has been used by the software industry for about the last decade or two decades, with some rather dramatic impacts in that industry. Stagegate, of course, is a macro process, sort of more of a strategic process, and Agile is a project management tool. So they're not substitutes for each other, rather they tend to be complementary. So let's get into the topic here. I'm talking basically mostly to manufacturers at this point, since this seminar is essentially targeted at producers of physical goods or hardware products. Stagegate was introduced to the manufacturing world in the late 1980s, and that's almost 30 years ago, and the world's become a heck of a lot faster, less predictable, and much tougher since the early days of Stagegate. It's more global, there's more competition, a lot of traditional markets that manufacturers find themselves in are now very mature, and there's a lot of uncertainties and risks. One of the issues we also hear from manufacturers is that we need innovation. We've been focusing a lot on renovations, small initiatives. We need some big breakthrough stuff. The trouble is our systems and methods are far too linear, far too rigid, far too planned to handle more innovative or true or more dynamic and more ambiguous higher risk projects. Another comment that we hear from a lot of people that's arisen over the last decade or so is the need for speed. We want to cut time to market in half. We want to increase productivity by 35%, R&D productivity by 35%, and we need to be a lot more agile. I think a lot of people use the word agile, meaning nimble and quick, and they don't really understand that agile, with a capital A, is a whole set of methodologies. So they're using the word agile perhaps a little bit incorrectly here. But people are saying we're not adaptive enough. We don't handle change. Our processes don't handle change very well. We talk about design freezes. How can you talk about design freezes in this day and age when things change so quickly? Our system's not flexible. It's too controlling. And another issue we hear a lot of people argue is our new product processes and methods are not context-based. We've designed one all-encompassing system, and one size clearly does not fit every possible type of project we have in our company. So we need a little more context-based approaches. The seminar basically deals with three important facets Two of them are evolutionary and one is revolutionary. Let me get the two evolutionary methods out of the way. One is making the process much more adaptive and context-based and flexible. And we get into that at some length because for some people that is the solution. Another evolutionary approach we talk about is accelerating your existing system. And we do that through about 6 different methods, including lean new product development, continuous improvement in new product development, and a few other methods as well. So the focus of accelerating the existing system through new tricks and techniques is also a major part of the seminar. And for many of you in the audience right now, that may be more than enough to meet all of your objectives and goals. The one revolutionary topic we spend some time about, and this is what this webinar is about, and it is approximately 40%, maybe 50% of the seminar, is building in these new, more revolutionary approaches, borrowed from the IT world, borrowed from the software world, and putting it into the manufacturing world. And you've all heard about Agile. I'm talking Agile with a capital A now, not a small a. Agile, software development, is a group of development methodologies. It's a set of methods based on iterative and incremental product development as laid out clearly in the Agile Manifesto, written in 2001. Now, Agile methods appeared in the late 1990s. They were developed by software project managers who back in those days, if anyone remembers software development back in the ugly days of the 90s, one of the worst track records of any industry. Typically, software projects were late, they were over budget, and very often the delivered product didn't work. And so they needed new ways of doing things in that world. And a handful of people started developing these new, what we call today the Agile methodologies. And this umbrella here shows some of the methods that were developed back in those days. In fact, by some people's counts, about 14 different methods were being implemented in the late 1990s. Finally, in 2001, the Agile Masters, a handful of them, got together in a cabin in Utah to discuss their methodologies and find common ground, and that's what became the Agile Manifesto. And basically, the manifesto emphasizes individuals and interactions over processes, working software over comprehensive documentation. You know, there had been far too much emphasis on PowerPoint presentations, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change instead of following a concrete plan. These were but some of the techniques or some of the principles outlined in the manifesto. It's worth a read. You can Google it and take a look at the manifesto. Two key tenets of the Agile Manifesto that have particular relevance to manufacturers is working software is delivered frequently in weeks rather than months. Now, for a manufacturer, that means you got to show something to management and to customers in rapid iterations, something that actually works so that you at least can demonstrate to the customer and to management. That is the principal measure of progress. So working software is the principal measure of progress. Translated into manufacturing is show me something that works. That's how I measure your progress, not whether you're hitting certain milestones or hitting certain gates or coming in with PowerPoint presentations. The other important thing about this whole process is that requirements and solutions, meaning the product requirements, the product definition, and product solutions, the technical solutions, evolve. They are not fixed. They evolve through collaboration between members of self-organizing cross-functional teams. The solution, or the so-called product definition, is not defined at the beginning of development, as in the traditional model. Rather, the product definition evolves during the development stage. A project can be approved for development, business case approved, with the product only 25 or 30 or 40% defined. That's sort of heresy in the traditional world. The plan of action, the action plan, the Gantt chart, that too is an evolving plan. In the Agile world, project teams typically plan for about 2 weeks, not 4 months. Here's another interesting trick that the Agile methods emphasize. Typically, it's a dedicated team on the project. Co-located, that means you'll have the entire project team in one room working 24/7, so to speak, on this one project, which is very, very atypical for the typical manufacturer who tends to spread design engineers and scientists and whatever over multiple projects, in fact spreads them too thin that sometimes the project moves at a crawl. Agile promotes adaptive planning, meaning everything is changing. There is no such thing as a fixed plan of action for the next 4 months. Evolutionary development and delivery, meaning the product definition keeps changing over the development cycle. And a time-boxed approach. That means everything is done in short increments called sprints that are time-boxed, typically 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or 4 weeks. And that is a constant time, so a certain rhythm starts to appear, a certain cadence. The method also encourages rapid and flexible response to change. Now, let me get into some of the elements and we call it the power of 9. 3 roles, 3 artifacts, and 3 tools. Actually, there's more than 9, but we cheat a little bit here for symmetry purposes. Artifacts, fancy word for the word thing. 3 things, basically time-box sprints. That means the entire project can be subdivided into a series of 2 to 4 week sprints, time-box sprints, in which work gets done. So everything is subdivided into 2, 3, or 4 week sprints. Second aspect is daily scrums. That means the project team, co-located in one room, has a meeting every morning to discuss what it is they got done yesterday, what they're going to get done today, and what problems they might be having. And finally, another key element of this is at the end of every sprint, after the project, after the product or whatever has been developed, has been demonstrated to management and has been demonstrated to customers at the end of every 2 or 4 week sprint, the team has a retrospective review to discuss what they did, why they did it, and how they can work together more effectively as a team. So these are called retrospects or retrospective meetings at the end of each sprint. Tools. This is a very visual process. And there's some neat new tools which we'll be getting into at the seminar. I'm not going to show them now. Product backlogs and sprint backlogs are a critical aspect. That's a very visual way of showing the work that has to get accomplished in the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks. The Scrum board is basically a board that shows, it's very similar to a Kanban board, tasks that are underway, tasks that are moving forward, tasks that are done. And finally, burn down charts, which gives a day-by-day representation, visual representation of the progress the project team is making. Very often in some companies, you'll find the team room has 3 regular walls and 1 glass wall, and displayed in the glass wall or on the glass wall, either in virtually or with hard copy, are these charts so that anyone walking by the room can see exactly where the team stands that day, whether they're a day behind schedule or a day ahead of schedule, and how things are moving along. Also, we get into what these charts look like and why they're very effective for project management in more detail in the seminar, obviously. There's also new roles, and new roles have been invented, and some manufacturers, frankly, have objections to these roles. Some adopt them 100%, others there's some pushback, and we're going to get into that discussion about when they might be when they might be suitable, and when they might not be. There's a new role called the product owner. He or she is not the project leader, not even on the project team. Product owner is from management who meets with the project team on a regular basis to give them direction. Then there's the Scrum Master. The Scrum Master, again, is not the project leader. In fact, there is no project leader anymore. The Scrum Master is basically a person who is a servant on the team who ensures that the team is following the Agile methods and proceeding as they should, sort of a process kind of guy. And of course, there's the development team themselves. In the software world, that tends to be a technical group. In the manufacturing world, that by necessity is a cross-functional group consisting of R&D, technical, engineering, marketing, sales, and operations people. So a little more complex in our world than in the software world. Sprints and scrums. A sprint is the basic unit in this Agile Scrum method. Scrum is one of the Agile methods that was developed, one of the 14 methods. And of all the manufacturers we've seen implementing this Agile methodology, they are all using or adhering to the Scrum approach. Sprints typically last, as I mentioned, 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks, typically 2 to 4 weeks. They are time-boxed, and that means exactly 2 weeks, not a day more, not a day less. Everything is time-boxed here. Each sprint is preceded by a sprint planning meeting where the entire team, and here's a picture of one, getting together where the tasks for the sprint are planned in order to achieve the sprint goal. So they map out in detail what they're going to do, perhaps over the next 10 working days in the case of a 2-week sprint, but not much further than the 2 weeks. They also have these daily stand-up meetings. Actually, that picture here is a photograph of a daily stand-up meeting, and that's at VantQuest, a 15 to 20-minute meeting to organize each day, set priorities, and discuss problems and share learning. And sprints, as I mentioned, are followed by a retrospective meeting where progress is reviewed and lessons for the next sprint are identified. Important note, before the end of the sprint, usually the project team is required to present or demo something to the stakeholders. And stakeholders are usually defined as customers and management. So something that works, ideally works, or at least a model or some representation of the product is presented. And by the way, it can't be a PowerPoint show. So that's sort of an idea. Now, when we start translating this into the world of Stagegate, here's a typical Stagegate process across the top. And I'll just highlight it here. It has 5 stages plus ideation. Very, very familiar stages: concept, build, business case, development, test, and launch. Down here is a representation of the Agile methods built within the stages. So what happens is we keep the stages, and we build the Agile approaches into the stages. And these little green circles are the sprints, or a representation of the sprints, typically 2 to 4 weeks. And these red circles are demonstrations to customers, seeking voice of customer and user feedback. And so you'll see from this diagram is at the end of every sprint, there is not necessarily a customer validation or iteration. One of the things people talk about in the Agile world is the heartbeat. In other words, we start with feedback from customers from the previous demo and unfinished product features left over from the previous sprint, decide on the highest priority features, and these are all inputs to the sprint planning meeting that the team gets together on right at the beginning. And they map out an achievable, realistic plan for the next sprint, possibly for the next 2 weeks. And then they get underway. Let me move ahead here. And then they get underway with their daily scrums, and at the end of the sprint, they produce a product increment or a product version or perhaps design drawings or something they can demonstrate physically to the customer and to management. So that's sort of the notion of this repetitive cycle, this repetitive iteration, often called the heartbeat, or very similar to what the word tact time in the world of manufacturing, if you're familiar with lean manufacturing, the notion of a tact time or a rhythm or a cadence. Every 2 weeks this occurs. Some of the key lessons from Agile that we really spend a lot of time on in this seminar is the Agile Stage-Gate teams are focusing on results, not on documentation. In too many gating processes today, the gates have become inundated with lengthy reports, PowerPoint presentations that take weeks to prepare. Wrong. So too many systems are focusing on the wrong deliverables. Does anyone really care? Does anyone actually read them? Being able to show something that works to stakeholders is what this new Agile Stage-Gate is all about. These are our results. And these results could be a virtual product, a prototype, a prototype, a crude model, a rapid prototype, anything that you can demonstrate to management and the customer to seek feedback and buy-in. And these rapid iterations with management and the customer helps get the product right, both from a marketing standpoint and also from a technical standpoint as well. And the whole notion here is moving quickly through the development phases, the various stages of the process, sprint to sprint, gate to gate, with frequent but short team meetings, these quick planning meetings, daily scrums, retro meetings, etc., and the visual tools that we'll be taking a hard look at. So there's a heavy emphasis on getting it done and getting it done fast and getting something physically done that you can demonstrate to people. Very different approach. Now, one of the first companies that I saw do this, I've been observing a handful of really early adopters, sort of the bleeding edge, if you will. And one of the companies that's had great success that started this 4 years ago in 2013 is a company that, and if anybody visits Home Depot, you'll recognize Chamberlain garage door openers. Chamberlain is a company that makes a lot of different remote control devices, everything from garage door openers to thermostats to even controlling your front door lock from your iPhone. They got into a situation where more and more of their products were being controlled by smartphones, and as a result, the IT component of product development was becoming a higher and higher percent. In the old days, these devices, like a garage door opener, was largely mechanical and electrical engineering. Now there's a heavier and heavier IT component. They started in 2013 merging the Agile methods their IT group was using with the Stagegate approach their physical group was using, and they basically are the first company I heard of and started observing and watching that applied Agile-Stage-Gate, or shall we say a hybrid model. They use sprints and scrums for physical and the IT components of a development project. Daily scrums about 20 minutes. They bring design reviews into some scrums as well, bringing in peers and outsiders. There is a scrum master in place. This is this process guy that makes sure everything's going right on each team. The sprints are about 2 weeks in length. They have now lengthened that to 3 weeks. They started out using 2 weeks. 3 weeks is what they figured they needed really to show something. At the end of the 3 weeks, the team must show something physical, the result of a completed task, not just a PowerPoint show. But it could be design drawings or CAD-generated animations or something that can be demonstrated. Project teams have dedicated team members. That's very critical. In other words, the project team members are, for all intents and purposes, 100% dedicated to that project. And so, as was pointed out by the Vice President of Engineering, we can't use this for every project. That would be impossible. You can't find dedicated teams for every project. So we hand-picked, we're very careful, we cherry-pick the larger, major revenue-generating projects, the higher-risk projects, the more ambiguous ones, and those are the ones we're applying this new methodology to. So they're keeping regular Stagegate for 80% of their projects and using Agile-Stage-Gate for the 20% interesting projects. And it's working very, very well, 4 years into. According to the process owner of all the different types of projects, they're getting about a 20 to 30% time reduction and a significant improvement in productivity. One of the problems they had at the beginning, just to show you that this is not a slam dunk, is that project leader and team were so focused on the next 2 weeks, like a football team focused on the next 10 yards, that they lost sight of the goalposts at the end of the field. And so management had to start intervening a lot more often to make sure the team was really headed in the right direction. One of the things that we notice in the new product process in Agile-Stage-Gate is the opportunity to build in these iterations with customers all the way through. And we'll be getting into what you present to customers. What can you realistically build in 3 weeks or 4 weeks that you could demonstrate and get feedback? The number of times I hear people saying to me, oh, it takes at least 2 or 3 months to come up with something we can show customers. And some smart companies are figuring out that this is not true. They can actually come up with rapid prototypes, prototypes, and computer animations, rapid prototypes, of course, that can be demonstrated to customers to test the market-facing hypothesis. And this diagram here attempts to show some of the things that can be done, but we'll get into that in a lot more detail. So what can be demonstrated? Obviously, software development is a little bit different than hardware development. With software development, in 2 weeks, a team can write thousands of lines of code and demonstrate screens that really work. And these screens can be sent out to customers online or potential users online, and literally the next day you get feedback. A little bit more difficult to do. For hardware products, it's a little harder to do this, but we are figuring out ways to do it with everything from virtual products and to prototypes and prototypes. We'll get into that more in the seminar. But the key is something that can be demonstrated and get feedback relatively quickly from willing and customers who are in fact partnering in the process with us. There's a major study done in Scandinavia. 5 Danish manufacturing firms, Lego being one of them. Lego was an early adopter of this method. Some of the positives with the Scrum Stage-Gate method they find is you have design flexibility, a much faster response to change, very much improved productivity, similar to the U.S. company I cited, improved communication, improved focus on the project, better prioritization, and much higher morale of team members. When I first started hearing about this 4 years ago, I began to worry about the health and welfare of the individual team members with this enormous time pressure. Were they heading for nervous breakdowns? Quite the contrary. They're actually much happier with this new system. That's one of the benefits that keeps getting reported again and again and again. The technical folks and the participants on the project team are much happier people. There's some negatives, and 2 years, 3 years when I really started working with companies on this, we naively believed this was going to be a slam dunk. It was just a matter of taking well-known Agile methods and parachuting it into the Stagegate process. We've sobered up a little bit. There are a lot of issues that manufacturers face that the software industry didn't. One of the biggest ones is dedicated team members. Usually it's not physically possible for a manufacturer, nor even sensible, because there are slips and lags in a typical process and waiting times, so it's silly to have 100% dedicated people. Another difficulty is that linking the team to the rest of the organization. Some people argue that the old processes are still a little bit too bureaucratic, and one of the issues here is you got to really lean down your existing Stagegate process to make this work well with Agile, and we'll get into ways to do that. Some of the other issues that people have found, and I'll just mention some of them, and these are from other sources, difficulty scaling up to programs rather than projects, a program consisting of a number of sub-projects and interlinked projects. Globalization is another issue, a proliferation of meetings and management buy-in. A lot of senior people are very skeptical about this new way of working. We have actually identified 12 major issues that manufacturers must deal with, and they are providing a very, very interesting challenge for some firms. Now, we are quite new at this, and the first thing I do want to say is we don't have all the answers yet. But what I'm hearing from the companies that I'm seeing in Europe and North America is those that are pursuing it, companies like Honeywell, companies like Lego, and of course Chamberlain that's been at it for as long as anybody, Tetra Pak in Europe is another big one. These companies are recognizing enormous payoffs in terms of productivity improvements, in particular, getting the product right first time, and also cutting time to market significantly. And so the benefits certainly are huge, but it's not as easy as it first looks. The notion of, oh, well, we already know what Agile is, our IT folks understand it, they'll just teach us, doesn't work at all that way. So we do spend a lot of time on dealing with some of these tough issues that are unique to manufacturers. Here's another example of a well-known company. Speaking of Scandinavian firms, you'll probably recognize the yellow vehicles. They adopted a hybrid Agile-Stage-Gate approach. They had been using their global development process, GDP, for some years. It's a standard, very well-executed Stage-Gate process. One of the things they used to do was do an awful lot of homework trying to get the answers to everything before they charged into development. They were trying to do all kinds of market studies, technical assessments, source of supply assessments, and they, in order to, as they called it, close the knowledge gaps before a project was approved for development. Admirable goal, not always possible to achieve, especially for riskier projects where there are many unknowns and a lot of ambiguity. No amount of market studies or technical studies done up front can get you all the answers. As a result, for these more ambiguous, riskier, more uncertain projects, they introduced Scrum into their Stage-Gate process with 4-week sprints, actually calendar month sprints. Each project team had a visualization room, a Scrum board on one side and alternate designs on the other side of the room. They did their daily Scrum meetings actually 2 times a week rather than every day, rather than 5 times a week, simply because their length of their sprints were an entire month and therefore not quite as time pressured as in the IT world. The entire team had to be available. Very, very good results at this yellow construction equipment firm. Clear focus and a tight follow-up created a strong drive on the team. They got into a lot of discussion about what the definition of done is. In other words, when you complete one of these sprints, you got to have something you can demonstrate to management, to the major stakeholders, and the sprint, of course, finally closed by a retrospective meeting. And the results have been quite remarkable. I do some teaching in Sweden, and I see this company on a regular basis. A speed increase by about 30%, very consistent with the Chamberlain data, a much more motivated staff and higher employee satisfaction. They're talking project team members, and excellent for closing open knowledge gaps. In other words, excellent for dealing with the unknowns, the uncertainties, and the ambiguities of a typical higher risk project. And they too, like Chamberlain, are 4 years into this, and most projects in that organization, that construction equipment business unit, now follow this Scrum method with the same positive results. There's a lot of tough questions. We've had a number of conferences, more in Europe than we have in North America. Germany seems to be another country that's moving ahead very quickly in this. And we get some very tough questions from the audience. And these are some of the questions and issues and answers we get into at our Boston and San Francisco seminar. How do you combine the best of both? How do you deal with the role of plans and deliverables for each stage's work? Do you still even have plans for an entire phase or stage of a project? And what about this product definition? How can you go into development with the product only 20 or 30% defined? Is that reasonable? How do you do it? And how do you define a sprint backlog? Is that the same as a product definition, or is this just a bunch of tasks we have to do? Another challenging question is the notion of integrating traditional planning with sprint planning. The idea of sprint planning is this. If you plan a 6-month phase of a project, and it's going to start changing within the next 3 weeks, why bother planning for 6 months? Why not just plan for the next 3 weeks? And that's essentially what the Agile approach is arguing. Of course, in a traditional manufacturing firm, if I, a project leader, walked into a project approval meeting with no plan of action for the whole development phase, I don't think I'd get my project approved. And so there is a bit of a reconciliation of this planning on the fly versus traditional Gantt chart planning that we are so used to in the manufacturing world. Another key issue is what can be demonstrated in 2 weeks. Most companies would have a difficult time, whether you're in the food business or making scanning machines in the medical field, of coming up with anything you can demonstrate in 2 weeks. But there are some tricks here, and that gets us into what is the definition of done. Dedicated teams is the elephant in the room. Finding the resources has been the obstacle we found in more companies that have been trying this, even in their pilot projects where they're supposed to be getting the resources. A tough issue, and some firms are coming up with some pretty neat new ways of doing this. First of all, it's not a dedicated team in the manufacturing world. And we are bending the rules a little bit there, but how far can you bend the rules without losing the benefits? Management buy-in is another big challenge, and we do spend quite a bit of time on how you get management buy-in and what some of the obstacles to management buy-in are, why the skepticism seems to occur. Scalability is a big issue because a lot of manufacturing projects are programs, not just projects, involving multiple interlinked projects, often on different continents. Some of the other issues we get into is, do you use Agile or Stagegate or one or the other or both together? And the answer usually is, for the important projects, for the ambiguous projects, we do both. When do you use the new system? Some people argue it's best for the development phase, best for the technical stages, development and testing. Other people are arguing, no, it's best for ideation, building business case, concept development, the early stages. And there's quite a bit of controversy around there. How does it fit with design thinking, etc.? For which stages? What's the role of gates? Surely gates have to change in this new world of Agile-Stage-Gate. Do you still need to do the upfront homework? If everything's going to change, do you still need the upfront homework? These are but 11 of about 15 key questions we go through in considerable detail in the seminar. And as you can see, while the theory of Agile makes a lot of sense, really doing it in a company, especially a manufacturing company of physical products, doing it is a little bit more challenging. By the way, why does it work? Here's what the users, here's what the early adopters are telling us. It gets the product right. This iterative development, by putting something in front of the customer, validates the product, gets something in front of customers, and also a solution to technical issues in even early proof of concept. A second key is it deals with uncertainty. In traditional Stagegate, the problem is identified and understood by investigations before development gets underway. When you're building your business case, you're supposed to do a market study and a voice of customer study and a source of supply assessment and a technical assessment and get all the answers. And the requirements for the solution are defined before development begins. Well, we know this is fiction. When there's a lot of uncertainty and no amount of studies can get all the answers, the problem can only be understood by experimentation, trial and error. And that's where this agile approach, this rapid, build something fast, test it, show it to somebody, and get some answers in a hurry. Accelerating development, obviously the time box sprints and the dedicated teams seem to be key to accelerating development. Focuses teams. The teams are dedicated to one project. Traditional Stagegate, most teams are heavily under-resourced and unfocused, simply spread too thin, which tends to slow down projects. And there's big improvements in this area from focusing teams, and finally, within team communication, because it's dedicated all in one room, and the daily scrums provide for the communication. Maybe we are running a few minutes late, Michelle. Maybe there's time for a few type-in questions if people are still online. Sean Montanez, I don't know if I'm allowed to mention people's names. Early adopters, did they develop the process solutions internally or work with an external partner? My company is at the early stage of defining and establishing a hybrid process. Most people find that they got into this. We do spend some time on next steps and how to implement. A number of companies I've had sort of peripheral relations with, they come to the seminars and they discuss their problems. I haven't really been into the company in depth, but they find that if they try to do it themselves, it's a bit the blind leading the blind. It's always helpful if they get somebody in who has some experience in this area, if nothing more as a facilitator. So that would be one suggestion. What we've also heard is do not bring somebody in from the software world. They just don't get it. They don't understand the manufacturing context and and they almost come in like priests or religious people and say, this is the way you do it. And of course, that's not the way you do it in the manufacturing world. That works in the software world. So don't go that route. And don't rely on your own IT people for the instruction either, because they don't get it either. So this is why you probably have to be very careful about who you find as an outside advisor. We can spend some time on that. Deborah, do you manufacturing-focused classes and software-focused classes? I'm not sure what she means by that question. It's not...
Do you provide, would you split your classes for manufacturing companies as opposed to software?
Oh, the software companies, the world of Agile is very well known, and there's a lot of consultants and Scrum experts, and there's organizations, etc. that you can go online and get these. There's dozens of them. So for the software world, this has been around for 20 years, and the solutions are pretty well known. And there's many people professing to be experts here. So you can go, if you're a software company, you can go to that route. What we're dealing here strictly is manufacturers, and that is a very, very different world when it comes to implementing these approaches. We've got to make a lot of changes and adjustments along the way to combine these agile approaches with our more traditional gating approaches. So we treat that as a very, very different segment of people. Now, interestingly enough, although the IT industry gets most of the notoriety these days in terms of innovation, 3/4 of all R&D spending in America is spent by manufacturers, not software developers. So we are still focused on the great majority of R&D spenders in America when we're talking about Agile Stage-Gate for manufacturers. Greg, based on your research, is it best to run a pilot project through the hybrid Agile approach before rolling it out to the entire organization? Absolutely yes. And we spend some time talking about, oh, by the way, 2 pilot projects, because sometimes one gets into trouble and you don't want to have egg on your face. We spend some time talking about what kind of a pilot project or two to select, how to set it up, what kind of management support, coaching, etc. There's a few tricks we've learned, the do's and don'ts about that, because those pilot projects tend to make or break the implementation and the credibility of this whole new way of working in the company. Can you please better explain the role of the product owner and how is the project manager fits in this model, and how project management fits in this model? Well, the product owner, as I mentioned, is a member of management who liaises with the project team and meets with them on a regular basis to provide direction. Very often the product owner, who represents management, spends some time when they're doing their sprint planning meetings and helps them fashion the sprint backlog, what tasks they're going to get done. That is a very different role than the traditional project leader, who is a member of the project team. And there is some pushback on this. For example, one large European company says, we're not going to invent a whole bunch of new roles for a group of projects that represent 20% of the total. It'll be absolute chaos. We're not going to have two sets of roles for two different types of projects. So they've stuck with the traditional roles. So we do spend a bit of time on that at the seminar. This is a complex, controversial issue, and there are arguments on both sides, and some people get rather heated in meetings about this issue. And how does project management, how does the project management fit in with this model? Well, project management per se, I mean, Agile is a form of project management. I think you meant is how does the product manager fit in with this model? Well, we could talk about the project manager, the project leader, which are two different types of people, and the product owner. And there's three very different roles here. And maybe there's room for 2 out of 3 as we move forward. And I think we're going to have to spend a bit of time on that, because I've been on some task forces where we're looking at rolling this out in one particular country in particular, and there's a number of companies on these task forces, and boy, do they fight about these issues. And there is no standard solution to this. A lot of it is your own culture, how you're used to doing it, and what works for you. One thing I want to make very clear to folks here, 2 points. Number one, or 3 points really. Number one, Agile is very well known and very well documented for the IT industry, for the software industry. It is not quite as well known, well documented for manufacturers. We are very, very new at this game, and the dominant model has not emerged, meaning people do not yet agree on the right way of doing it, and we are still experimenting and trying different possible solutions. So we're at a very early stage of adoption here, much, much earlier than, well, we're back about 2001 or maybe even 1995 in the software world. Second point I want to make is that it is not as easy as we thought. That when we first got into this, we thought it would be just a matter of taking these Agile principles and banging them into our traditional gating approaches and running, and it's turning out to be not quite so easy. The benefits are huge, but the challenges are a little more than we thought. So this is a bit tougher than you might first imagine. At first, it looks pretty simple, slam dunk. It's not. And I guess the third point is that probably the best way to move forward on this is obviously learn about it and see what other people have done. And that's why we have these seminars and conferences, because you can learn a lot from what other firms, who interestingly enough have been quite open about their experiences. I'm surprised at how open they have been about sharing experiences, manufacturers I'm talking about now. And then so learn about it, get up to speed on it, form a task force, and then as somebody suggested, get a couple of pilots underway. Don't spend a lot of time designing the perfect process, because you never will, and that's a sort of futile exercise. And get some pilots underway and learn on the fly. And in the Agile tradition, monitor, fix, and improve as the pilots move forward. And so using this approach, obviously everyone's going to end up with a slightly different version of the process, which is fairly typical. So 3 points. It's a very, very different world in the manufacturing world. It's not a slam dunk. And finally, there are some real good tricks about how to move forward and implement this.
Well, this has been a fantastic webinar. Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge. Lisa, thank you for organizing this event today. This is Michel Delifer from Planisware, and we thank you and wish you a good day to everyone.